Hello everyone, this is Wylam here. In today's Fuji Friday, I want to talk about some tips that I want to impart for the Fujifilm's X-T3. Some of these can be translated over to the X-H1, and probably more than a couple can go to the X-T20. This video was inspired by one of my community members, Milton, who just got the X-T3, and I wanted to give him some things that I've learned about the X-T3. Hopefully it helps some of you guys out, but this isn't going to be groundbreaking stuff, but I figured I'd impart some knowledge to you. So the first thing we're going to go over is how to get the most battery life out of your camera. We all know that the camera batteries aren't really all that great on the X-T3 or any of the X-T lines, so let's go ahead and show you some battery saving features. The first one that I really like would be in the gear menu. So down here, what I want you to go to is the connection settings. And in here, there are Bluetooth settings. And what I would like you to do is to turn off your Bluetooth. This is going to save you some battery life. Now, if you do find Bluetooth to be useful and you do want to transfer pictures to your camera, then obviously you can't do this. But for people who want to have the max battery life, you definitely want to turn this stuff off. The other one I want to talk about is this button right here. This actually changes the screen and also your EVF, your eye EVF, and how they work. So naturally, right out of the box, there is a sensor right here that will turn off. Let me get the lens off. So there's a sensor right here that will turn on the EVF when you have your eye up to it. If you hit the button, this will turn into an EVF only one. So if you hit it again, it'll be an LCD only. Hit it one more time. This one turns off both screens. So right now, both the screens are off. When you have your eye to it, it actually turns on the eyepiece. This is the best power savings if you actually need battery life. And this is what I usually go around with when I'm shooting outside, is that I will have both screens off and then I'll put the camera to my eye and this will turn on. This is going to save you a lot of battery life. You can get a good half day of shooting on it with this type of setting. This is the one I would really recommend to people if you like using your eye cup. There are a lot of people who like to use the screen. In this case, you're going to have to remember to turn your camera on and off quite often. Otherwise, you're going to drain your battery super quick. Again, if you hit the button one more time, it goes back to the default, which is the screen is on automatically. And then when you have your eye up, it'll turn on the eye cup. So in this part, I'm going to go ahead and cover some of the settings that I use. So if you hit the menu button, in here is the first one, which is image quality. Image size, I generally go with a 16:9. The reason why I go with a 16:9 is because that is the standard size that the internet uses. I have to crop a whole lot less if I go by 16:9 rather than the 3:2. If you want the highest image resolution, the 3:2 is what you want. But more often than not, all of these are going to go on the internet anyway. So 16:9 is what I would go with, and it's what I like using. For image quality, I like to shoot both in fine and raw. It does take up a lot of space, but I definitely like having raw. I do go with lossless compressed. This, I feel like everybody does that. So let's talk about the upsides and downsides. Uncompressed has the upside of it's going to be a lot easier for your computer to actually import in because it's not compressed. That means when you import in, your computer has to do a whole lot less work. Lossless compressed means that you're going to compress the image, which means it's going to take up less size on your SD card. But when you actually import it onto your computer is going to uncompress it, which means imports are going to take a little bit more time. So the trade-offs are there, whichever one you choose. I'm going to go ahead and move down, whatever film simulation you want. Dynamic range is kind of an interesting one. This one is kind of up to you. Most of the time, I do have it in auto just to let the camera figure it out. The only time that I don't is when I'm shooting at night. When I'm shooting at night, I usually set it to ISO 400. The reason why I set it to ISO 400 is because you know you're going to be shooting at a very high ISO anyways. The downside to using DR400 is that this is going to be the minimum ISO, which I think is 640. So if you actually go lower than that, what you'll see is it'll drop down to DR200. So that is the biggest downside, but if you're shooting at night, that really isn't a problem. So that's what I generally do. So that is my preferred preference. If I'm shooting at night, I go ahead and go with a 400%. This is more of a preference thing. Have I actually seen an image quality bump? I don't think I really have, to be honest with you, but I do like doing that. I feel like it gives you the best options when you're shooting with this camera in low light situations, is to go ahead and bump the range up to 400%. The next one to talk about is autofocus and manual focus, and to be honest with you, I leave most of the things alone. The only thing that I tend to do is I actually tend to have less focus points. I find that I get around a lot easier with my joystick if there's less focus points. There isn't really too many times where I need that fine quality, but if you do, you can definitely go with a 425, but I just find it a lot easier to go with less focus points and then just use the joystick. It just allows me to move around a whole lot easier. But in this display setting, I don't really do all that much. The drive settings, the biggest one to talk about is definitely going to be the shutter type. The default that you're going to get with your camera is that it's going to show mechanical shutter. And what you can read with the electronic front curtain shutter is that when it's actually slower than 1/2000th of a second, there should be an image quality bump, even though it's probably a very slight one with your electronic first curtain shutter. So the option that I really like to use is the electronic first curtain shutter and the mechanical shutter. So under 1/2000th of a second, it'll use the electronic first curtain shutter, and when it's faster than 1/2000th of a second, it'll go over to mechanical shutter. I'm kind of curious. I don't really know why this isn't the default right out of camera. It just seems like a no-brainer to me. So I definitely recommend changing that at a minimum. That's really the only thing that I change in the shoot mode. If we go down to flash, I don't use flash ever, so I leave that at default. When it comes down to movie mode, for any of you who's using it as a video cameras, here are my suggestions to it, but keep in mind my content is mostly on YouTube, so these settings are primarily for very fast content creation. What I would generally say is that if you have a very fast modern computer, so something built within the last year or two, you can probably get away with using H.265. It is very hard on your computer processors. But if you have a slower computer, I definitely recommend going with H.264. Now, whichever one you go with, there are two settings that you can go with. You can go with long op and all intra. So the trade-off in here is that long op will give you a much smaller file size, while all intra will give you much more color, but it's going to be an increased file size. What I will say about this is that long op is going to be much harder on your CPU because you have less color, and your processor is going to have to work a lot harder to make sure that all of the colors is in the same frames, while all intra, all of that color information is actually in each frame, which means your CPU is going to have to work a whole lot less. The problem with using all intra is that it's 400 megabytes per second, so you're going to fill up your SD cards very quickly. So long op is usually the way to go if you want to film a whole lot, but all intra if you really want that quality, and it's going to be easier on your computer CPU. But generally speaking, I do want the smaller file sizes, so I generally go with long op, which is also the reason why I built a more modern computer, so I can deal with these new compression settings. Going down to dynamic range, again, I have the same philosophy as I do with my photos. If I'm at daylight or if I'm swapping between daylight and darkness, I'll keep it at DR 100, but if I know I'm going to be shooting in low light, I'll switch over to DR 400, which means increased dynamic range. The trade-off of that, of course, is that the minimum settings is going to be at, I think, 640 ISO. I don't remember what that marking is, but it's not really that big of a deal because you're going to be shooting in low light anyways. Moving on to the final menu, the only thing that I change here is in the button setups. This thing right down here. You have your focus lock, and you also have your white balance lock. I like to change these to a switch mode, so you push it once to turn it on and you push it again to turn it off, just because holding down in order to have these locks tends to be a little bit annoying. This one is definitely personal preference, but I find it much easier to have it on a switch rather than having to hold it in order to turn on that particular feature. Auto white balance lock is definitely very useful if you're going to be taking multiple pictures of the same scene. And then autofocus lock is very useful if you want to keep the same focus. So those are my quick settings that I like to use on my camera. So that was a super quick rundown of all of the settings that I use on my X-T3. If you got some settings that you would like to share, please leave it in the comments below. We can all learn from each other, and it's definitely great seeing the community help each other out. But that was my quick videos on some tips for the X-T3 and probably the X-H1 because they are very similar in terms of menu builds. If you have any questions, please leave in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video.